The mountain air in the Kunar province of Afghanistan carried the metallic taste of danger. March 2019. Staff Sergeant Marcus Dalton moved through the compound's shadows like death itself, his HK-416 rifle an extension of his body. The Navy SEAL insignia on his plate carrier caught the moonlight for just a moment before he disappeared into darkness again. They called him Reaper. The nickname wasn't poetry, it was mathematics. 147 confirmed kills across 3 tours, 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Bronze Stars, a Silver Star that came with a classified citation nobody was allowed to read. At 35 years old, Marcus Dalton represented everything the United States military machine could forge from raw human material. Precise, lethal, and utterly convinced of his own invincibility. The Taliban compound ahead held 3 American contractors. Intelligence suggested they had maybe 6 hours before the hostages were moved or executed. Standard rescue protocols said, wait for air support. Reaper's team didn't do standard. Tango, 11 o'clock, sentry post, whispered Chief Petty Officer Ryan Brooks through the comm system. Reaper's response came without hesitation. I see him. The suppressed shot was poetry. The sentry dropped without a sound, his AK-47 clattering against stone that had witnessed violence since Alexander the Great marched through these same mountains. Reaper was already moving before the body stopped twitching. The entry was textbook. Flashbang through the window, 3 seconds. Door breach. The interior of the compound erupted into chaos and thunder. Reaper moved through it like a surgeon, each shot deliberate, each movement economical. 2 tangos down in the first room, 1 in the hallway. The 4th tried to use a hostage as a shield. Bad decision. Reaper's shot entered the tango's left eye socket from 40 feet away while the man was moving. The hostage didn't even get blood on his shirt. 14 minutes after insertion, they were extracting with all 3 contractors alive. 0 SEAL casualties. 1 more legend added to the Reaper mythology. The video footage would later be shown at SEAL training facilities. This is what excellence looks like. This is what we build. But nobody showed the footage from 6 months later. That video told a different story. Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, present day, February 2024. The morning sun had that crystalline quality unique to coastal Carolina, sharp enough to cut shadows into geometric precision across the military installation. The mess hall at Camp Lejeune had served breakfast to Marines and attached Navy personnel since 1942. The building had witnessed everything. Men shipping out to Pacific Islands they'd never returned from. Desert Storm veterans swapping stories over powdered eggs. Young Marines, fresh from Paris Island, still figuring out which fork to use. But it had never witnessed what was about to happen at 0643 hours on this particular Tuesday morning. Staff Sergeant Marcus Reaper Dalton pushed through the mess hall doors with the confidence of a man who owned the ground beneath his boots. 6'3", 220 pounds of muscle and scar tissue. His Navy SEAL insignia wasn't just pinned to his uniform. It was burned into his identity like a brand on livestock. The conversations didn't stop when he entered. They paused, like someone had turned down the volume on the world for just a moment while everyone recalibrated to his presence. The younger Marines tracked him with their eyes, that mix of admiration and fear that Reaper had come to expect, had come to need like oxygen. Private First Class David Martinez felt his stomach tighten from his corner table. 22 years old, Marine infantry. Martinez had made the mistake of hesitating during an obstacle course 3 weeks ago. Reaper had been observing the training. The hesitation lasted maybe 2 seconds. The consequences lasted 3 hours. Reaper had made Martinez do push-ups until his arms gave out, then flutter kicks until he vomited, then more push-ups in his own vomit, while Reaper explained to everyone within earshot exactly what happened to pussy Marines who freeze up when their brothers need them. The incident hadn't been officially reported. These things never were. You didn't report Navy SEALs. Not if you wanted a career, not if you wanted to avoid becoming a target yourself. Martinez watched Reaper load his breakfast tray with the precise movements of a man who treated even cafeteria navigation as a tactical operation. Eggs, bacon, toast, coffee black enough to strip paint. The kid wanted to disappear into his uniform. But Reaper wasn't looking at Martinez this morning. Reaper was looking at the woman in civilian clothes sitting alone at the corner table near the emergency exit. She was maybe 5'8", athletic build, auburn haircut in a practical style that suggested military background but wasn't regulation. She wore dark jeans, a simple gray jacket, and was reading what appeared to be a technical manual. Her back was to the wall. Her seat faced the entrance. Her body language was relaxed, but her positioning was tactical. These details registered in Reaper's predator brain immediately. What registered more was that she hadn't looked at him when he entered. Every other person in the mess hall had acknowledged his presence in some way. A glance, a nod, a sudden intense interest in their breakfast. But this woman had simply continued reading, continued eating her toast, continued existing in his space without granting him the tribute of her attention. His ego registered it like a slap. Lieutenant Sarah Hayes watched the interaction from her position 3 tables over. 26 years old, Marine Corps officer, 3 months ago, Reaper had cornered her in a supply room, his hand on her lower back, sliding down, his breath on her neck, his voice in her ear saying she looked good in uniform, that female Marines were usually distractions, but at least she was easy on the eyes. She had frozen. That's what bothered her most. All her training, all her martial arts classes, all her conviction that she'd fight back if it ever happened to her. She'd frozen. When she tried to report it to the executive officer, she got a paternal smile and a suggestion that she was maybe misinterpreting friendly advice from a decorated veteran. Reaper had PTSD, after all. Everyone knew that. Cut him some slack. Think about whether she really wanted to make accusations that could ruin both their careers. She hadn't pushed it. The shame of that lived in her chest like a stone. Now Hayes watched Reaper's attention lock onto the mystery woman, and she felt something that might have been hope mixed with dread. Hope that someone else might not back down. Dread about what Reaper did to people who challenged him. Staff Sergeant Jenny Cruz sat with her platoon, trying to focus on her breakfast burrito. 33 years old. Female SEAL support specialist. Cruz owed Marcus Dalton her life. Kandahar Province, 2020. IED strike. Her Humvee flipped, fire spreading. Reaper had pulled her out while taking small arms fire from 3 directions. She'd watched him kill 2 Taliban fighters with his sidearm while dragging her to safety with his other hand. The man who saved her life wasn't the man sitting in this mess hall. That man had known restraint, had known honor. The Marcus Dalton who pulled her from burning wreckage understood that strength came from protecting the vulnerable, not preying on them. The man loading his breakfast tray right now? Cruz had watched him shove PFC Martinez against a wall hard enough to leave bruises. Had watched him make sexually aggressive comments to female personnel. Had watched him dare anyone to report him. His SEAL status held up like a shield that made him untouchable. She'd said nothing. The shame of that lived in her chest right next to Hayes' stone. Maybe they were all collecting stones. Maybe that's what this place did to people. Reaper moved through the mess hall like a shark through shallow water. His trajectory would take him directly past the mystery woman's table. The conversations around him adjusted to his presence. Marines lowered their voices, made space, anticipated. They were about to get a show. They always did. "Morning, miss." Reaper's voice carried that particular texture of forced friendliness wrapped around steel. He stopped beside her table without being invited, his tray still in his hands, his presence looming. "Haven't seen you around here before. I'm Staff Sergeant Marcus Dalton, Navy SEAL Team 6. The woman looked up from her manual. Her eyes were green. They met his with the kind of steady, unimpressed gaze usually reserved for people examining moderate bathroom mold. She held his stare for exactly 2 seconds, then returned to her reading. Good morning. That was it. 2 words. His smile remained fixed, but stopped reaching his eyes. He set his tray down on her table. Uninvited, unwanted. You new to the base? The woman looked up again. This time her expression suggested she was being interrupted during something important, which technically she was, except Reaper didn't consider reading more important than his attention. Something like that. She returned to her manual. The pages rustled with crisp efficiency. Reaper noticed her hands for the first time. No ring, short nails, calluses on the knuckles and the heel of her palm. Those weren't office worker hands. Those were hands that knew violence intimately. Well, let me officially welcome you to Camp Lejeune. Reaper sat down across from her without asking permission. The chair scraped against linoleum with a sound like nails on opportunity. This is a serious military installation. We like to know who's sharing our space, especially civilians who seem to have unrestricted access to our facilities. The woman closed her manual with deliberate care. She looked at him fully for the first time, and something in her expression made several of the more experienced Marines sit up straighter. It wasn't fear. It wasn't intimidation. It was the look of someone evaluating a problem and calculating the most efficient solution. I appreciate the welcome, Staff Sergeant. My name is Rebecca Chen. I'm here on official business. Her voice was calm, professional, the kind of calm that comes from genuine confidence rather than bravado. Reaper's predator brain registered this immediately and didn't like it. People who weren't afraid of him usually had reasons. He needed to know those reasons. Official business. That's pretty vague. He leaned forward slightly. This was his intimidation posture, the one that made junior enlisted personnel stumble over their words, the one that made complaint-filing female officers suddenly decide maybe they'd misunderstood things. What kind of official business requires a civilian to have access to a restricted military mess hall? Rebecca's expression remained neutral. Her hands rested on the table in a way that looked casual but wasn't. Several Marines who had actual combat experience recognized the positioning. Ready stance disguised as relaxed. The kind that's above your clearance level, Staff Sergeant. The words landed like artillery strikes. Marines at 3 surrounding tables suddenly found their breakfast fascinating. Jenny Cruz closed her eyes. Sarah Hayes felt that dangerous hope flare brighter in her chest. Nobody talked to Reaper like that. Nobody. Reaper's voice rose just enough to carry to the surrounding tables. Above my clearance level. It wasn't a question. It was a challenge wrapped in disbelief and soaked in contempt. Lady, I've earned decorations most people only read about in history books. I've fought in places that don't exist on maps. I've done things that keep this country safe while people sleep. I've operated in countries our government won't acknowledge we have personnel in. He was speaking louder now, making sure everyone could hear, establishing dominance through volume and credentials. It usually worked. There's very little in this military that's above my clearance level. Rebecca picked up her coffee cup, took a measured sip. When she set it down, her movements were precise enough to be ballet, economic enough to be tactical. I'm sure you've had quite an impressive career, Staff Sergeant, but my work here doesn't require your involvement or approval. The mess hall had gone from quiet to absolutely silent. Over 1,000 military personnel were now invested in this confrontation. They could feel something building, the atmospheric pressure before a storm. Reaper leaned forward further. His voice dropped to what he considered a menacing whisper, but was actually loud enough for everyone nearby to hear clearly. Listen here, sweetheart. The word landed like a slur. Sarah Hayes felt her hands ball into fists under the table. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this is my house. These are my troops, my base, my territory, and I don't appreciate some mystery woman walking in here acting like she owns the place. For the first time since the conversation began, Rebecca's expression shifted. The neutral mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something underneath that made Reaper's combat instincts suddenly scream warnings he was too proud to hear. It wasn't anger in her eyes. It wasn't fear. It was the kind of cold calculation he'd only seen in the faces of enemy combatants who had already decided you were dead and were just working out the tactical details. Your house. Rebecca's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath now. Visible steel. The kind that doesn't just cut, the kind that severs. Your troops. That's an interesting perspective, Staff Sergeant. Reaper realized he'd overstepped somehow, but his pride wouldn't let him retreat. Not here. Not in front of over 1,000 personnel. Not from some civilian woman who probably spent her days pushing papers in some Defense Department cubicle. His reputation was everything in this environment. He felt it slipping away with each word this woman spoke, and that feeling made him double down instead of backing off. That's right. And in my house, we show respect to decorated veterans who've earned their place here through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Rebecca stood up slowly. Reaper was surprised to realize she was taller than he'd initially assessed. Maybe 5'8", 5'9". With her frame and the way she carried herself, it suggested serious physical conditioning. The kind that came from dedicated training, not casual gym visits. She began gathering her things with deliberate care. Each movement was precise and controlled. The coffee cup positioned just so, the manual aligned perfectly with the edge of the table before being picked up. Her jacket folded with military precision. Respect is earned, Staff Sergeant Dalton, not demanded, and it's certainly not granted based on how loudly someone announces their credentials. The comment drew a few barely suppressed sounds from some of the younger Marines. Not quite laughter, not quite coughs, the kind of noise people make when they're trying very hard not to react to something while simultaneously failing completely. This was the sound of Reaper's authority cracking in public. He stood as well. 6'3", 220 pounds. He used his considerable height advantage to loom over her, a tactic that had worked on everyone from Taliban fighters to Marine colonels. You want to see what I've accomplished? His voice carried across the now silent mess hall like a sermon, like testimony, like the declaration of a king. I've conducted hostage rescues that saved American lives while operating behind enemy lines with zero support. I've neutralized high-value targets in conditions that would break most operators. I've completed underwater demolition missions in waters so cold, hypothermia was a certainty, not a possibility. He paused for breath in effect, made sure everyone was listening, made sure they understood who they were watching challenge him. So maybe you should think twice before dismissing what I've done for this country. Rebecca finished packing her materials, slung her bag over her shoulder with practiced ease, looked up at him with that same unreadable expression that was starting to make him genuinely uncomfortable. That's quite impressive, Staff Sergeant. Your service record speaks for itself. For just a moment, Reaper felt vindicated. Finally this woman was showing him the respect he deserved. Finally, she was acknowledging what he'd accomplished. Finally, however, that single word carried more weight than any explosive Reaper had ever handled. Your service record also includes 3 formal reprimands for conduct unbecoming an officer, 2 incidents of insubordination, a pattern of behavior that suggests you believe your military achievements give you license to treat others as inferior, and 1 investigation that's currently ongoing regarding multiple allegations of harassment and abuse of authority. The mess hall stopped being silent. It stopped being anything. Time itself seemed to pause, while every Marine, every sailor, every person in that room processed what had just been said. Reaper felt the blood drain from his face. His stomach dropped into his boots. His mouth went dry. This woman had access to his complete military file, information that was supposed to be classified, information that was only available to his direct command structure and military justice officials, which meant she was neither random nor civilian. How do you? Rebecca cut him off with the efficiency of someone used to controlling conversations. As I mentioned, Staff Sergeant, I'm here on official business. That business gives me access to a great deal of information about the personnel stationed at this facility. She moved a step around him. Reaper's mind was racing through possibilities, trying to figure out who she was, what agency she represented, what authority she wielded. But his pride and confusion overwhelmed his tactical thinking. His hand shot out and grabbed her arm. Not hard enough to bruise, hard enough to stop her. We're not done here. You don't get to drop bombshells about classified information and then just walk away. The moment his hand made contact with Rebecca's arm, something shifted in the mess hall. Every soldier present recognized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Some kind of line had been crossed. Some kind of point of no return had been reached. Rebecca looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at his face. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the silent room in a way that loud voices never could. Staff Sergeant Dalton, I'm going to give you exactly 3 seconds to remove your hand from my person. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a threat. It was simply information, data. Like telling someone the temperature or the time. Reaper should have recognized the tone, should have remembered his training, should have recalled that the most dangerous people in the world are the ones who make violence sound like weather reports. Instead, his ego answered, "Or what? You'll file a complaint? Report me to my commanding officer?" He actually laughed. The sound was harsh and artificial. "Lady, I've been through more disciplinary procedures than you've had hot dinners. Nothing sticks. It never does. You know why?" He leaned closer to her face, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "Because I'm valuable. Because I'm decorated. Because I've sacrificed more for this country than some paper-pushing bureaucrat could ever understand. That's how the real military works." Rebecca's expression didn't change, but somehow the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. When she spoke, her voice was even quieter than before. 3. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Several of the more experienced Marines began shifting in their seats. Combat veterans, people whose instincts were screaming that they were about to witness violence. The kind of violence that happens too fast to stop. Reaper's response would be talked about in military mess halls around the world for years to come, analyzed in leadership classes as an example of what not to do. Become legend and cautionary tale simultaneously. Instead of releasing her arm, he tightened his grip. Deliberately, made sure everyone could see. Established dominance through physical restraint the way he'd done dozens of times before to junior enlisted personnel who got mouthy. The way he'd done to Sarah Hayes. The way he'd done to David Martinez. The way he'd learned nobody would stop him from doing. 2. The single word carried absolutely no emotion. No anger, no fear, no anticipation, just countdown, just information. 1. Reaper leaned even closer to her face, made sure his voice carried to every corner of the mess hall, made sure everyone heard him declare his status, made sure they understood who they were watching assert dominance over whom. "Remember, I'm a Navy SEAL." What happened next would be analyzed frame by frame on security footage, would be described in official reports, would be recounted by 1,040 witnesses with remarkable consistency, would become the kind of story that gets told and retold until it's mythology. But the basic facts were never disputed. Rebecca's response was instantaneous. Her right hand moved in a blur, palm strike targeting the mandibular hinge where jawbone meets skull, disrupting equilibrium and causing neurological confusion. As Reaper staggered from the impact, his balance already compromised, she swept his legs at precisely the moment when his weight distribution was most vulnerable. The 6'3", 220-pound Navy SEAL went down hard, body hitting linoleum with a meaty thud that echoed through absolute silence. When he tried to rise, her boot connected with his solar plexus in a controlled strike that collapsed his diaphragm into spasm without causing serious internal injury. The entire sequence, 3.8 seconds. Reaper lay gasping, struggling for air. Rebecca stood over him, breathing normal, posture relaxed but ready. There was no satisfaction in her expression. No gloating, no triumph, just the same neutral mask she'd worn throughout their entire conversation. The silence was absolute. Staff Sergeant Dalton. Her voice carried clearly through the frozen mess hall. Over 1,000 military personnel sat motionless, trying to process what they just witnessed. When someone asks you to remove your hand, the appropriate response is compliance, not escalation. Reaper struggled to get air back into his lungs. He rolled onto his side, coughing and gasping, his face flushed with oxygen deprivation and humiliation that cut deeper than any blade ever could. Around him, 1,040 witnesses sat in complete, stunned silence. The legendary Navy SEAL lay on a mess hall floor, defeated decisively and publicly by a woman half his size who'd given him 3 seconds of warning and every opportunity to make a different choice. The legend was over. The reckoning had only just begun. The silence stretched like wire pulled to breaking point. Major Jennifer Walsh, the mess hall duty officer, was the first to break from her shock-induced paralysis. She stood up from her table with mechanical precision, her training finally overriding her amazement at what she just witnessed. "Stand down," Major Walsh called out, though it was unclear who the order was directed toward, since the fight was already clearly over. Rebecca reached into her jacket with slow, deliberate movements. Nobody was going to accuse her of making threatening gestures. She withdrew a leather credential wallet and flipped it open, holding it at eye level for Major Walsh to examine. Walsh's expression went through several transformations in rapid succession. Surprise, concern, understanding, something that might have been dread. She examined the credentials carefully. Defense Intelligence Agency, Internal Affairs Division, Senior Investigator, Rebecca Chen. The photo matched. The holographic seals were legitimate. The authorization codes were current. "I see," Major Walsh said quietly, handing the credentials back. "Ma'am, I had no idea you were... I wasn't informed of your presence on the base." "That's quite all right, Major. My visit wasn't scheduled through normal channels." Rebecca glanced down at Reaper, who was finally managing to get some air back into his lungs. His face remained flushed. His eyes watered from the diaphragm spasm. His pride lay in pieces around him like shrapnel from a grenade he'd pulled the pin on himself. "I had hoped to conduct my business here without any incidents, but Staff Sergeant Dalton seemed determined to make that impossible." By this time, Reaper had managed to push himself up into a sitting position, though he was still breathing heavily. The physical pain was manageable. SEALs trained to handle pain, but the psychological impact was catastrophic. His entire identity had been built on being the most dangerous person in any room. That identity had just been dismantled in front of everyone who mattered to him. "What the hell are you?" Reaper wheezed, looking up at Rebecca with confusion and something that might have been fear showing through the anger. "I'm someone who doesn't appreciate being manhandled by overly aggressive personnel, regardless of their service record or military credentials." Major Walsh cleared her throat nervously. Ma'am, perhaps we should continue this conversation in a more private setting. The dining facility isn't the appropriate venue for... Actually, Major, I think this is exactly the appropriate venue. Rebecca interrupted gently but firmly. What happened here serves as an important lesson for everyone present. She turned to address the room full of soldiers. Her voice carried clearly to every corner of the mess hall without her needing to shout. It was the voice of someone accustomed to commanding attention through competence rather than volume. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just witnessed is what happens when someone allows their ego to override their judgment and their respect for others. Staff Sergeant Dalton is undoubtedly a skilled and experienced military professional, but his accomplishments don't give him the right to physically intimidate or assault anyone, regardless of their gender or apparent civilian status. Reaper finally managed to get to his feet, though he was still unsteady and clearly shaken. His uniform was disheveled. His pride was in tatters. He was acutely aware that over 1,000 troops had just watched him get demolished by someone he dismissed as harmless. "This isn't over," Reaper said, his voice still labored. "I don't know who you think you are, but Staff Sergeant Dalton." Major Walsh's voice cut through his protest like a blade. "I strongly advise you to stop talking and report to my office immediately for debriefing." But Reaper was beyond rational thought. The humiliation was too complete, too public, too devastating to the carefully constructed image he'd spent years building. He'd saved lives. He'd served his country. He'd sacrificed and bled and killed for this uniform. And in less than 5 seconds, a woman he'd never met had reduced him to a gasping, defeated figure on a mess hall floor. "I want to know who authorized you to be here," Reaper demanded, ignoring his commanding officer's directive. "I want to know what agency you work for, and I want to know what gives you the right to assault a decorated military veteran." Rebecca's expression finally shifted slightly, showing the first hint of something that might have been amusement. "Assault, Staff Sergeant? You grabbed me first. What I did was simply defend myself against unwanted physical contact. Every person in this room witnessed the entire sequence of events." She was absolutely right, and everyone knew it. The video surveillance system had undoubtedly recorded the entire incident. There were over 1,000 witnesses who had seen Reaper initiate the physical contact. Rebecca's response, while devastatingly effective, had been purely defensive in nature. "Furthermore," Rebecca continued, "my authorization to be here comes from significantly higher up the chain of command than anyone stationed at this facility. If you'd like to challenge that authorization, I encourage you to contact your base commander and request clarification." She paused. Let the silence build. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, but somehow carried even more weight. "And before you go, there's something you should know. Colonel Patterson sends his regards." The effect of those 5 words was electric. Reaper's face went from flushed red to pale white in the span of a heartbeat. His eyes widened. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Everyone in the room saw the recognition, the shock, the understanding that this wasn't random at all. Rebecca picked up her bag and turned toward the exit. The sea of soldiers parted before her, creating a clear path to the door. Nobody wanted to be in her way. Nobody wanted to be the next person she had to deal with. As she reached the door, she paused and turned back one final time. Her voice carried across the silent mess hall with the weight of prophecy. "Remember, Staff Sergeant Dalton, being a Navy SEAL doesn't give you the right to put your hands on people who haven't given you permission to do so." And then she was gone, leaving behind a mess hall full of stunned military personnel and one very humbled Navy SEAL who would never quite look at himself the same way again. The whispers started 30 seconds after she left, then conversations, then the rush of 1,000 people, all trying to process the same impossible event. Major Walsh was shouting orders about maintaining silence and operational security, but it was like trying to hold back the ocean with a chain-link fence. Reaper stood in the center of the chaos, his mind fixed on one detail. Colonel Patterson sends his regards. Bull Patterson, his old mentor, the man who'd saved his life in Afghanistan, the man he hadn't spoken to in 9 years, the man who'd called him a coward and walked away. Bull had sent this woman. Bull had access to classified operations. Bull had just orchestrated the most public humiliation of Reaper's entire career. The question was why? Reaper stumbled toward an empty table and sat down heavily. His jaw ached where Rebecca had struck him. His ribs were sore from her boot. But these pains were nothing compared to the realization forming in his mind like a mushroom cloud. This wasn't random. This wasn't an accident. This was targeted, planned, executed with precision. He'd been set up. Staff Sergeant Jenny Cruz approached his table cautiously. She'd known Marcus Dalton for 8 years, had served alongside him in Afghanistan, had always respected his skills and experience, but she'd also witnessed his increasingly problematic behavior over the past few years. And now she was watching him realize something that looked like it might break him completely. "Marcus," she said quietly, sitting down across from him. "You okay?" Reaper looked up at her with hollow eyes. "Did you see what just happened, Jenny? Did you see how fast she moved?" "Yeah, I saw it. We all saw it." "I've been in combat for over a decade," Reaper continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've fought trained killers from all over the world, and some woman I've never met just took me down like I was nothing." Cruz studied her friend's face and saw something she'd never seen there before. Genuine humility mixed with fear and confusion. The invincible warrior confronting his own vulnerability for the first time. "Marcus, I don't think she was just some random woman." "What do you mean?" "The way she moved, the techniques she used, the fact that she had access to your classified military records. That woman was definitely military or intelligence, probably special operations, maybe even more elite than anything we've seen." Cruz paused, choosing her words carefully. "And she mentioned Bull Patterson. You served with him, right?" Reaper's jaw tightened. The name alone brought back memories he'd spent years trying to bury. 400 miles away, in a farmhouse outside Richmond, Virginia, Colonel William Bull Patterson sat in his study, watching a laptop screen. The video feed came from Rebecca's body cam. He'd watched the entire confrontation in real time, his weathered face impassive, but his eyes revealing something that might have been satisfaction mixed with sadness. At 67 years old, Bull Patterson had lived more lives than most men could imagine. 3 tours in Vietnam as a Marine Force recon operator, operations in Central America during the 1980s that officially never happened, training missions with Allied forces across 4 continents, a career spent in shadows, doing the kind of work that kept the world turning while the world pretended men like him didn't exist. His hands, scarred from decades of violence and hard work, closed the laptop. The message had been delivered. The first move had been made. Now he waited to see if Marcus Dalton would figure it out before it was too late. Bull stood and walked to the window overlooking his property. 20 acres of Virginia farmland, a far cry from the jungles of Vietnam or the mountains of Afghanistan. This was supposed to be retirement, peace, a chance to finally stop fighting. But some fights never really end. They just change shape. His eyes moved to the photograph on the mantel. A young woman in Marine Corps dress blues. First Lieutenant Rebecca Patterson, his daughter. 24 years old in the photo, dead at 25. The system had protected her predator. She'd paid the price. For 20 years, Bull had lived with that failure. Bull's phone rang. He answered without checking the caller ID. Only 3 people had this number, and he knew which one was calling. "It's done." Rebecca's voice was calm and professional. Dalton took the bait exactly as predicted. Full confrontation in front of 1,040 witnesses. Multiple violations. Assault on a federal investigator. It's all on video. "How do you feel?" Bull asked. The question wasn't professional, it was personal. "Like I just poked a wounded animal. He's going to come looking for answers. He'll come looking for me first. We served together. He knows I'm involved now. You ready for that conversation? Bull looked at his daughter's photograph again, remembered teaching her to ride a bike, remembered her graduation from Annapolis, remembered getting the phone call that every parent fears. I've been ready for 20 years. Bull, Rebecca's voice softened slightly. This isn't just about your daughter. Dalton has victims, real people he's hurt. We're doing this for them too. I know. Doesn't make it feel any less personal. Personal is good. Personal means we don't quit when it gets hard. Bull smiled despite himself. That was pure Rebecca Chen, the woman who turned pain into fuel and fury into focus. Get back to base, start the interviews, build the case. I'll handle Dalton when he comes. And if he doesn't come, he will. I taught him better than that. He won't leave questions unanswered. It's not in his nature. They ended the call. Bull returned to his window and waited. Patience was something you learned in Vietnam tunnels and Afghan mountains. Patience was how you survived, how you won. Marcus Dalton would come, and when he did, Bull would teach him one final lesson about what it meant to be a warrior. Back at Camp Lejeune, Reaper sat in the base commander's office, trying to process the magnitude of his situation. Colonel James Harrison sat across from him, a phone still in his hand from the call he just finished with Pentagon intelligence. Harrison was 53 years old, career Marine, 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. He'd seen combat. He'd seen men break under pressure. He'd seen the full spectrum of human behavior in extreme conditions. But this situation was unprecedented. Staff Sergeant Dalton, Harrison's voice was carefully neutral. I've just received a briefing from the Defense Intelligence Agency regarding the incident that occurred in the mess hall this morning. Reaper said nothing. His jaw still ached. His pride still bled. The woman you encountered is Senior Investigator Rebecca Chen. She's with DIA Internal Affairs Division. She's been conducting a covert investigation into allegations of misconduct among special operations personnel at this installation. The words hit Reaper like physical blows. Investigation, covert, misconduct. What allegations? His voice sounded hollow, even to himself. Harrison opened a folder on his desk. The file was thick, too thick. Multiple complaints have been filed against you over the past 18 months. Sexual harassment, abuse of authority, intimidation of junior personnel, creating a hostile work environment. That's bullshit. Who filed complaints? I've never been officially notified of any. The complaints were filed through proper channels. They were then systematically buried by members of your team who had access to administrative systems. 3 senior enlisted personnel are currently being investigated for obstruction of justice and dereliction of duty. Reaper felt the floor dropping away beneath him. His teammates had been covering for him, and now they were all going down together. Sir, I can explain. You can explain why you physically grabbed a federal investigator in front of 1,000 witnesses? Harrison's voice remained level, but carried an edge that could cut steel. You can explain why I'm receiving reports of a pattern of abuse that goes back over a year? You can explain why 3 of my senior enlisted personnel felt the need to bury complaints rather than allow them to be properly investigated? Reaper had no answers. For the first time in his adult life, his credentials and his status weren't enough to protect him. As of this moment, you are on immediate administrative leave. All security clearances are suspended. You will have no contact with any personnel involved in this investigation. You will surrender your credentials and remain confined to quarters pending formal charges. Sir, with all due respect, I'm a Navy SEAL. I've served this country for... I'm aware of your service record, Staff Sergeant. I'm also aware that your service record doesn't give you immunity from consequences. Harrison stood, signaling the meeting was over. You're dismissed. Report to First Sergeant Hayes for processing. And Dalton? Reaper turned at the door. The video footage from this morning is already spreading through military channels. By tomorrow, every base in the country will have seen it. Whatever reputation you had is gone. The only question now is whether you face this with dignity or make it worse. Reaper walked out of the office in a daze. The hallways of the command building felt like they were closing in. Marines and sailors moved past him without meeting his eyes. Word had already spread. The Reaper had fallen. His phone buzzed with messages, most from SEAL buddies wanting to know what the hell happened. A few from teammates distancing themselves. One from Chief Brooks that just said, "Bro, you need a lawyer. Now." Reaper found himself moving on autopilot, muscle memory guiding him to the parking lot. He got in his truck and started driving. No destination, just movement, just trying to outrun the reality closing in around him. His mind kept returning to one name, Bull Patterson. They'd met in Afghanistan in 2012. Reaper was 23, fresh from SEAL training, full of confidence and hunger to prove himself. Bull was 55, Marine advisor attached to the SEAL team. Everyone called him Old Man. Everyone respected him like a force of nature. The mission was supposed to be simple: capture a high-value target in a compound outside Kandahar. Intelligence said minimal resistance. Intelligence was wrong. The team had walked into an ambush, 3 SEALs pinned down in a kill zone. Reaper was one of them. He could still remember the sound of AK-47 fire tearing apart the mud walls around him, the smell of cordite and blood, the certainty that he was going to die in a country he couldn't find on a map 6 months earlier. Bull Patterson had been their salvation. The old Marine had gone into that kill zone like it was a Sunday walk. 55 years old and moving like a predator. Suppressive fire, tactical movement, extraction under contact. He'd pulled all 3 SEALs out personally. Reaper had watched Bull kill 4 Taliban fighters with a combination of rifle work and hand-to-hand combat that belonged in movies. Except it was real. The old man was real. Afterward, Bull had trained him. Hand-to-hand techniques that went back to Vietnam-era programs. Pressure point manipulations. Leverage-based fighting for smaller combatants facing larger opponents. The kind of skills that weren't in any manual because they came from experience measured in decades and bodies. Bull had also taught him philosophy, the warrior code, honor, restraint, the difference between a soldier and a killer. Real strength, Bull had said one night under Afghan stars, is knowing when not to use force. Any idiot can pull a trigger. Any thug can throw a punch. A warrior knows when violence is necessary and when it's just ego wearing camouflage. Reaper had listened, had believed, had internalized those lessons. For a while. Something had changed after 2015. Maybe it was the missions. Maybe it was the kills. Maybe it was coming home to a country that didn't understand what he'd done for them. The warrior code had started feeling like weakness. Restraint had started feeling like vulnerability. He'd run into Bull at Camp Pendleton in 2015. Reaper was between deployments. Bull was teaching a training course. They'd gone for beers like old times. Except it wasn't like old times. There'd been an incident at a bar. A female Marine lieutenant had said something Reaper didn't like. Something about SEALs being arrogant. It wasn't even directed at him personally, but he'd been drunk and angry and tired of civilians and peacetime Marines criticizing operators who actually did the dirty work. He'd grabbed her arm, made her apologize, used his size and status to intimidate her into submission. It had felt good. It had felt like reasserting order in a world that had stopped making sense. Bull had seen the whole thing. They'd fought in the parking lot afterward, not physically, worse, with words that cut deeper than any blade. "You're becoming everything I fought against," Bull had said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "You're using your skills to prey on people weaker than you. That's not warrior code. That's just being a bully in uniform." "She disrespected the teams," Reaper had shot back. "Someone had to teach her respect. Respect isn't taught through fear. And you didn't defend the teams. You satisfied your ego. You're just old, soft, The world changed while you were teaching courses and playing farmer. Bull had looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. When you're ready to be a man instead of playing at being a warrior, you know where to find me. Until then, stay away from me. I don't associate with cowards. The word had hit like a bullet. Coward. Coming from Bull Patterson, it was the worst insult imaginable. Reaper had told himself Bull was wrong, told himself the old man didn't understand modern warfare or modern military culture, told himself that Bull's generation was weak and his generation was harder, stronger, more real. He'd told himself a lot of lies over the past 9 years. Now those lies were collapsing like a house built on sand. Reaper's truck had somehow driven itself to the outskirts of Richmond, Virginia, 4 hours from Camp Lejeune. He hadn't consciously decided to come here, but his subconscious had known where he needed to go. Bull Patterson's farm sat on 20 acres of rolling Virginia countryside. The farmhouse was old, but well-maintained. A barn, a tractor, the kind of place that looked like it had existed forever and would exist long after everyone currently alive had turned to dust. Reaper parked his truck at the end of the long driveway. He could see Bull working on the tractor near the barn. The old man hadn't looked up, hadn't acknowledged his presence. But Reaper knew Bull had heard the truck. Knew Bull was aware of every detail of his surroundings. Combat instincts didn't fade with age. Reaper got out of the truck and walked toward the barn. Each step felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He didn't know what he was going to say, didn't know what he wanted, didn't know anything except that he needed answers, and Bull was the only person who could provide them. Bull finished whatever he was doing with the tractor, wiped his hands on a rag, finally turned to face his former protege. The two men stood 15 feet apart. Between them lay 9 years of silence, betrayal, and choices that couldn't be unmade. Bull spoke first. His voice carried across the distance with the same authority it had carried across Afghan battlefields. "Took you long enough. I figured you'd be here by noon. It's almost 1,600 hours. You losing your edge, Marcus? You sent her after me. It wasn't a question. I sent her to do a job. You made it personal. I saved your life." Bull's expression didn't change. "In Kandahar, 2012, you were part of the team that provided covering fire when I extracted those SEALs from the ambush. I remember. Then why? You saved my life once. You've dishonored that sacrifice every day since." The words hung in the air like smoke. Reaper felt them land but couldn't quite process their meaning. "I don't understand." "No, you don't. That's the problem." Bull walked toward him slowly, closed the distance to 5 feet, close enough to talk without shouting, close enough to read every micro-expression on the other man's face. "I had a daughter, Marcus. Did I ever tell you about her?" Reaper shook his head. "Rebecca, First Lieutenant Rebecca Patterson, Marine Corps. 24 years old when I last saw her alive. 25 when she put her service pistol in her mouth and pulled the trigger." The information hit Reaper like a physical blow. He hadn't known. Bull had never mentioned family during their time together. "I'm sorry, I didn't." She was stationed at Camp Pendleton, 1999. Her commanding officer was a decorated combat veteran. Multiple tours, medals, respect from everyone who served under him. He was also a predator. Bull's voice remained steady, but something in his eyes burned with an intensity that made Reaper want to step back. He assaulted her, sexually, multiple times. She reported it through proper channels. 3 separate complaints. Every single one was buried. The command structure protected him because he was valuable, because he was decorated, because men like him were considered untouchable. The parallels were impossible to miss. Reaper felt his stomach turn to ice. 6 months after her 3rd complaint was dismissed, she killed herself. Left a note explaining everything. Explaining that she'd trusted the system and the system had failed her. That she'd trusted men like me to protect her and we'd chosen our own instead. Bull's hands clenched into fists. Not in anger toward Reaper, in anger toward himself. I spent 20 years trying to fix the system that killed my daughter. 20 years banging my head against walls built by men who thought medals and service records made them immune to consequences. 5 years ago, DIA recruited me to help investigate these cases, to build accountability where none existed. And that woman, Rebecca Chen, not my daughter, but she carries the name. She's former Marine, faced her own predators, survived, decided to make sure others survive too. I trained her, taught her everything I know about fighting and systems, and how to make the powerful finally face consequences. Bull took another step closer. Now they were almost touching. Two warriors, two generations, two very different understandings of what service meant. You remind me of the man who killed my daughter, Marcus. Decorated veteran, combat hero, untouchable, using your status as a shield to prey on people who couldn't fight back. I didn't assault anyone, not like that. You grabbed Rebecca Chen's arm after she told you to stop. You physically intimidated junior enlisted personnel. You've sexually harassed female officers. Multiple complaints have been filed against you. The only difference between you and the man who killed my daughter is that we caught you before you pushed someone to suicide. The words stripped away every defense Reaper had prepared, every justification, every rationalization. He saw himself suddenly through Bull's eyes, and the view was devastating. I have PTSD, Reaper said, and even as the words left his mouth, he knew how weak they sounded. So do I, Bull replied flatly. 3 tours in Vietnam, operations in El Salvador, Panama, Desert Storm, more combat than you'll see in 3 lifetimes. I have nightmares. I have triggers. I have days where the past feels more real than the present. Bull's voice dropped lower, became harder. PTSD explains behavior. It doesn't excuse it. You don't get to use your trauma as a license to traumatize others. That's not how this works. That's not what being a warrior means. Reaper had no response, no defense, nothing left except the crushing weight of his own actions, finally made visible. She gave you a warning, Bull continued relentlessly. 3 seconds. She told you exactly what would happen. You chose your ego over her explicit boundary. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. And choices have consequences. The sun was setting over the Virginia farmland. The shadows grew long. The temperature dropped. Reaper stood in the gathering darkness and realized he'd been standing in darkness for years without knowing it. What happens now? He finally asked. Now you face the investigation, the evidence, the consequences. Now you decide whether you're going to continue being the man who assaults federal investigators in front of witnesses, or whether you're going to remember what I tried to teach you about honor. Bull turned and walked toward his farmhouse, stopped at the porch, looked back one final time. My daughter's name was Rebecca. She believed in the core, believed in honor, believed that men like you would protect her. She was wrong. But maybe her death doesn't have to be meaningless. Maybe the 7 people you victimized get justice. Maybe that changes something. He climbed the porch steps. His hand was on the door when Reaper called out, "Why are you telling me this? Why not just let the investigation destroy me?" Bull looked back over his shoulder. In the fading light, Reaper could see the years etched into the old warrior's face. The scars, the weight of all the things he'd seen and done and failed to prevent. Because I still believe in redemption, even for cowards, even for you. Whether you deserve it is something you'll have to answer for yourself. The door closed. Reaper stood alone in the darkening Virginia countryside, his entire world reduced to rubble around his feet, wondering if there was any way back from the man he'd become. The drive back to Camp Lejeune took 4 hours, but felt like 4 minutes. Reaper's mind was caught in a loop, replaying Bull's words over and over like a damaged recording. My daughter's name was Rebecca. She believed in the core, believed in honor. She was wrong. The base security guard waved him through without comment, but Reaper caught the look. Everyone knew. In the digital age, shame traveled at the speed of light. His phone had been buzzing non-stop during the drive. He'd ignored it. Now, parked outside his barracks, he finally looked. 73 messages, 12 voicemails, most from SEAL buddies, some supportive, some distancing themselves. A few that were just question marks, waiting for him to explain the unexplainable. One message stood out. From Chief Petty Officer Ryan Brooks, his swim buddy from the teams. The message was simple. Bro, they're interviewing witnesses. Multiple people. This is real. Get a lawyer. Reaper climbed out of his truck and walked toward his quarters. The March evening air carried the salt smell from the coast. Under different circumstances, it would have been pleasant. Right now, it just reminded him that even the ocean had limits, boundaries that couldn't be crossed without consequences. His quarters felt smaller than he remembered. The walls were decorated with the usual SEAL memorabilia. Photos from deployments, challenge coins, a framed certificate for his silver star. All the physical evidence of a career built on excellence and violence. None of it meant anything anymore. He sat on his bed and tried to remember when things had gone wrong. There wasn't a single moment. It had been gradual, like hypothermia. You didn't notice until you were already dying. Afghanistan, 2018. That mission, the one that still woke him up at night. They'd raided a compound based on intelligence that said it was a Taliban weapons cache. The intelligence was right, but what it hadn't mentioned was the 3 teenage boys sleeping in the back room. They'd come out shooting with AKs that were probably older than they were. Reaper had dropped all 3 with headshots before his conscious mind had even processed what he was seeing. 14 tangos total that night, 11 adults, 3 kids. The debrief had been clinical. Enemy combatants, hostile action, clean shoot, no questions, no problems, mission success. But Reaper had seen their faces, had seen them in every quiet moment afterward. Boys who should have been worried about school, or girls, or whatever teenage boys worried about in Afghanistan. Instead, they were dead on a concrete floor while he stood over them with a smoking rifle. He'd never told anyone. SEALs didn't talk about things like doubt or guilt or the crushing weight of what they'd been asked to do. SEALs were supposed to be hard, unbreakable, machines that killed on command and felt nothing afterward. So Reaper had shoved it down, drowned it in alcohol, covered it with aggression and the kind of toxic masculinity that the teams not only tolerated, but encouraged. Real operators didn't go to therapy. Real operators didn't admit weakness. Real operators dominated every space they entered and dared anyone to challenge them. He'd become a caricature of a warrior. And somewhere in that transformation, he'd forgotten what Bull had tried to teach him about the difference between strength and brutality. A knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Reaper opened it to find Staff Sergeant Jenny Cruz standing there with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. "You look like shit," she said, handing him one of the cups. "Feel worse." Cruz came in without being invited and sat in the single chair his quarters provided. They'd served together for 8 years. She'd earned the right to bypass formalities. "I talked to DIA today," Cruz said. "They interviewed me for 3 hours." Reaper's stomach dropped. "What did you say?" "The truth, that you saved my life in Kandahar, that you're the most skilled operator I've ever worked with, that you've also become someone I don't recognize over the past few years." She sipped her coffee, didn't look at him directly. "I told them about PFC Martinez, about watching you shove him against a wall hard enough to leave bruises, about the threats, about the way you've treated female personnel like they're somehow less than because they weren't born with your specific set of chromosomes and combat experience. Jenny, I also told them it was my fault, that I saw it happening and said nothing, that I chose loyalty to a teammate over doing what was right, that I'm as guilty as anyone for letting you become this." Cruz finally looked at him. Her eyes were red. She'd been crying recently. "They're interviewing 7 people who filed complaints, Marcus. 7. Do you understand what that means? 7 different people were hurt enough by your actions that they went through the trouble of filing official complaints. In a system that's designed to protect people like you, 7 people were brave enough to go on record, despite knowing it probably wouldn't matter. Reaper set his coffee down. His hands were shaking slightly. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. What the hell were you trying to do then? The question hung in the air. Reaper didn't have an answer. I talked to Bull Patterson, he said finally. He told me about his daughter. Cruz nodded slowly. Rebecca. I looked her up after the mess hall incident. When that woman said Colonel Patterson sends his regards, I figured there had to be a connection. She killed herself because the system protected her abuser instead of her. And now you're the abuser the system protected. You see the irony, right? Reaper did. God help him, he did. Cruz stood up, set her coffee cup on his desk. When she spoke again, her voice was gentle but firm. They're filing formal charges tomorrow. Assault on a federal officer, multiple counts of conduct unbecoming, abuse of authority. Your lawyer is going to tell you to fight it, to attack the witness's credibility, to use your service record as a shield. She moved toward the door, stopped with her hand on the handle. For what it's worth, I hope you don't. I hope you stand up in front of those 7 people and tell them you're sorry, that you were wrong, that they deserved better. It won't fix what you did, but it might mean you're still capable of being the man who pulled me out of that burning Humvee. She left. Reaper sat alone with his thoughts and his coffee and the slow, crushing realization that his entire identity had been built on a foundation of sand and ego. The next morning brought the formal charges. Captain James Foster, his appointed military defense attorney, laid them out with clinical precision in a conference room that smelled like industrial cleaner and broken careers. Assault on a federal officer during the performance of her duties. That's the big one. 20 years maximum sentence. They won't push for maximum, but still. Foster was 42, former JAG prosecutor turned defense attorney. He'd seen every type of military criminal case imaginable. His expression suggested he'd already decided how this one would end. Conduct unbecoming an officer and gentleman. 3 separate specifications based on witness testimony. Abuse of authority. Creating a hostile work environment. The list goes on. Foster spread papers across the table like he was dealing cards in a game Reaper had already lost. The prosecution has video evidence from multiple sources. The mess hall incident is on security cameras from 4 angles. They have body cam footage from investigator Chen showing the entire interaction. They have cell phone video from 2 months ago showing you at an off-base bar bragging about how you handled Lieutenant Hayes. Reaper's head snapped up. What video? Apparently one of the junior Marines at the bar that night recorded you on his phone. You were drunk. You described in explicit detail how you intimidated Hayes into not filing a formal complaint, how you used your status and her fear of career repercussions to silence her. Foster pulled out a tablet and turned it toward Reaper. Hit play. The video quality was poor, bar lighting and shaky camera work, but the audio was crystal clear. Reaper's voice, thick with alcohol and bravado, explaining to his buddies how he'd cornered Hayes in the supply room, how she'd frozen, how he'd told her that making accusations against a SEAL would destroy her career, how she'd transferred units instead of fighting. On the video, drunk Reaper laughed, said something about how junior personnel needed to learn their place. Real Reaper, sitting in the conference room, felt bile rise in his throat. That video alone destroys any defense we might mount, Foster said. It shows premeditation. It shows a pattern. It shows consciousness of guilt. You knew what you were doing was wrong, and you did it anyway. Can we suppress it? Illegal recording or something? It was in a public bar. No expectation of privacy. It's coming in. Foster closed the tablet, leaned back in his chair, studied Reaper with the dispassionate eye of someone calculating odds. Here's the reality. We can fight this, Attack the witness's credibility. Paint you as a decorated combat veteran being railroaded by political correctness. Play up your PTSD, your service record, everything you've sacrificed for this country. Will that work? Maybe. The panel will be military officers. Some of them will be sympathetic to the warrior being persecuted narrative. Some won't. It's a gamble. Foster leaned forward. Or you can plead guilty. Take responsibility. Throw yourself on the mercy of the court. With your service record, we might get the sentence reduced. Maybe avoid prison time entirely. Dishonorable discharge is inevitable either way. Dishonorable discharge means I lose everything. Benefits, status, identity. You lost those the moment you grabbed Investigator Chen's arm. Now we're just negotiating the terms of surrender. Reaper stood up, paced the small conference room like a caged animal. His entire adult life had been the military, the SEALs, the Brotherhood, the mission. Without that, who was he? I need time to think. You have 24 hours. After that, we have to enter a plea. Reaper left the conference room. His body moved on autopilot, muscle memory guiding him to the obstacle course, where he'd spent countless hours building the mythology that had just shattered. PFC David Martinez was running the course. Reaper watched from a distance as the young Marine attacked each obstacle with determination that bordered on desperation. Martinez had always been small for infantry, maybe 5'6", 140, soaking wet, the kind of kid who had to work twice as hard as everyone else just to meet minimum standards. The kind of kid Reaper had targeted for that exact reason. Martinez finished the course and was walking back toward the start when he noticed Reaper watching. The young Marine froze. Fear flickered across his face before he got it under control. Reaper should have walked away, should have followed the no-contact order, should have done a lot of things. Instead, he walked toward Martinez, hands visible and non-threatening. "Staff Sergeant," Martinez said, his voice tight, "I don't think you're supposed to." "I know. I'm not supposed to contact witnesses. I'm violating direct orders being here." Reaper stopped 10 feet away, close enough to talk, far enough to not be threatening. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what I did to you. The obstacle course incident, the humiliation, all of it. You didn't deserve that." Martinez stared at him like he'd started speaking Martian. "I was dealing with my own shit," Reaper continued. "PTSD I wasn't treating. Guilt I wasn't processing. And I took it out on you because you were smaller and younger and couldn't fight back. That's not what a leader does. That's what a bully does." Martinez's expression cycled through confusion to anger to something that might have been cautious hope. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because tomorrow I'm probably going to plead guilty to charges that will end my career. And before that happens, I need you to know that what I did to you was wrong. Completely, inexcusably. It had nothing to do with your performance or your capability. It was about my weakness, not yours." "They're interviewing me tomorrow," Martinez said quietly. "DIA, about the wall incident and everything else. Tell them the truth, all of it. Don't hold back because you think it might help me. I don't deserve help. Those 7 people who filed complaints deserve justice." Reaper turned to leave, then stopped. "You're going to be a better Marine than I ever was. You know why? Because you'll remember what it feels like to be on the receiving end of abuse. You'll remember and you'll make damn sure you never inflict that on someone else. That's the kind of leader the Corps needs." He walked away before Martinez could respond. The young Marine stood on the obstacle course for a long time afterward, trying to process an apology he'd never expected to receive. The DIA interviews took place over the next 3 days in a secure conference room that felt designed to extract truth through sheer discomfort. Rebecca Chen conducted most of them personally, with Bull Patterson observing via video link from Virginia. Lieutenant Sarah Hayes was first. She sat with military posture, hands folded on the table, and recounted the supply room incident with clinical precision. The unwanted touching, the comments about her appearance, the veiled threats about career consequences if she reported. He made me feel like my body was the only thing that mattered, Hayes said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. Like all my training and education and effort were irrelevant because I happened to be born female. And when I tried to report it, I was told I was making waves, that I should consider his PTSD, that maybe I'd misunderstood. Rebecca took notes, but her expression never changed. She'd heard versions of this story too many times. Different names, different details, same underlying rot. Did you consider that you might have misunderstood? Rebecca asked gently. Every day, I convinced myself maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just friendly banter that I took wrong. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Hayes looked directly at the camera, knowing Bull was watching. But then I saw him do the same thing to other women, saw the pattern, realized it wasn't about me specifically, it was about power, about reminding us that we were allowed in his space only as long as we accepted being objectified and intimidated. The interview lasted 2 hours. When it was over, Hayes felt lighter somehow, like she'd been carrying a weight she hadn't fully acknowledged until it was removed. PFC Martinez's interview was shorter but more emotional. The young Marine broke down twice while describing the obstacle course incident and its aftermath. I thought about eating my gun, Martinez admitted, the words coming out in a rush like poison being expelled. After he humiliated me in front of everyone, after he made me do PT in my own vomit, after everyone saw me as weak, I thought maybe they'd be better off without me. Rebecca stopped taking notes, leaned forward. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what Martinez was describing. But you didn't. You're still here. Why? My mom, she's the reason I joined, wanted to make her proud. If I'd done that, it would have destroyed her. Your mom should be proud. You survived something that was designed to break you. You filed a complaint knowing it might not matter. You're sitting here now telling your story. That takes courage. Martinez wiped his eyes. It doesn't feel like courage. Courage never does. It feels like fear and nausea in doing it anyway. The pattern repeated across 7 interviews, 7 different stories, 7 different people who'd been targeted by someone who'd forgotten that power comes with responsibility. Staff Sergeant Jenny Cruz's interview was last and proved to be the most damaging to Reaper's case, precisely because she was clearly conflicted about giving it. Marcus Dalton saved my life, Cruz said from the start. I need that on record. Kandahar, 2020, IED strike. He pulled me out of a burning vehicle while taking fire from 3 directions. I owe him everything. But, Rebecca prompted, but the man who saved me isn't the man who shoved PFC Martinez against a wall, isn't the man who sexually harassed Lieutenant Hayes, isn't the man who created an environment where people were afraid to report abuse because of his status and connections. Cruz's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. I watched him change after 2018. Something happened on a mission. He never talked about it, but I could see the damage. PTSD symptoms, drinking, aggression that went beyond normal operator intensity. And instead of getting help, he weaponized it, used his trauma as an excuse to traumatize others. Why didn't you report his behavior? Because I'm a coward. Because I owed him my life and I confused debt with loyalty. Because the SEAL community protects its own, even when we shouldn't. Cruz looked directly at Rebecca. I'm as guilty as anyone for what happened. I saw it. I knew it was wrong. I said nothing. Those 7 people suffered because people like me chose silence over accountability. Rebecca closed her notebook. The interview was over. The case was built. The evidence was overwhelming. The only question now was whether Marcus Dalton would fight or accept responsibility. The answer came the next morning. Reaper entered Captain Foster's office at 0800 hours. He'd been up all night thinking about Bull's daughter, about the 7 people he'd hurt, about the man he'd become versus the man he'd wanted to be. "I'm pleading guilty," he said before Foster could speak. "To all charges. No deal, no negotiations. Guilty." Foster blinked. "Marcus, I strongly advise—" "I don't want advice. I want to plead guilty and face whatever consequences come. Those people deserve that much. You understand this means dishonorable discharge, possible prison time, loss of all benefits except combat-related medical care?" "I understand." Foster studied him for a long moment. "What changed your mind?" "I talked to Bull Patterson. He made me see what I'd become. And I realize I have two choices. I can fight this and drag 7 victims through hell to maybe salvage scraps of a career that's already dead. Or I can stand up and admit I was wrong, accept consequences, maybe salvage some small piece of honor from this wreckage. Honor won't keep you warm in Leavenworth. No, but it might let me look at myself in the mirror again someday." The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Military justice moves faster than civilian courts when the evidence is overwhelming and the defendant isn't fighting. The courtroom was smaller than Reaper expected. 5 officers sat as the panel. 3 men, 2 women. All field-grade officers with combat experience. All wearing expressions that suggested they'd already decided how this would end. Major Peters handled the prosecution. He was efficient and merciless, laying out the evidence with surgical precision. Video from the mess hall showing Reaper grabbing Rebecca Chen. Security footage of him shoving Martinez. The bar video of him bragging about intimidating Hayes. Testimony from 7 victims. The evidence portion took 4 hours. When it was done, there was no doubt about Reaper's guilt. The only question was severity of punishment. Captain Foster's defense was brief. Service record, combat decorations, PTSD diagnosis. He painted a picture of a good man broken by war and bad choices. It was competent but ultimately ineffective against the mountain of evidence. Then came the victim impact statements. The panel allowed each of the 7 complainants to address the court directly, to explain how Reaper's actions had affected their lives. Martinez spoke about the suicide ideation, the therapy he was still attending, the way he flinched whenever someone raised their voice. Hayes described the career doubt, the way she'd considered leaving the corps she loved because one man had made her feel unsafe in her own uniform. Cruz, not a victim but a witness, spoke about the guilt of silence, the way complicity in abuse was itself a form of betrayal. By the time all 7 had spoken, several panel members were visibly emotional. This wasn't abstract justice. This was real harm to real people. The panel chair asked if the defendant wished to make a statement before sentencing. Foster advised against it. Anything Reaper said could be used to justify harsher punishment. Reaper stood anyway. "I have no excuse for what I did. PTSD explains behavior. It doesn't excuse it. I had options, therapy, treatment, support. I chose ego and aggression instead. I chose to make my trauma everyone else's problem." His voice was steady but quiet, stripped of the bravado and authority that usually characterize his speech. To PFC Martinez, Lieutenant Hayes, Staff Sergeants Cruz and Chen, and the 3 other complainants whose names I won't say publicly to protect their privacy, "I'm sorry. Completely. Those words can't undo harm, but they're all I have to offer." He paused, looked directly at the panel. "I'm guilty of every charge. I deserve whatever sentence you impose. The only thing I ask is that you make the consequences clear in public, so the next operator who thinks his status makes him untouchable will know it doesn't. So the next victim who thinks reporting won't matter will know it might." He sat down. Foster looked at him like he just committed professional suicide, which, technically, he had. The panel deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous on all counts. Guilty of assault on a federal officer. Guilty of conduct unbecoming. Guilty of abuse of authority. Guilty across the board. The sentence came swift and severe. Dishonorable discharge. Reduction to E1, the lowest enlisted rank. 18 months in military prison at Fort Leavenworth. Forfeiture of all benefits except VA medical care for combat-related PTSD treatment. The gavel fell. Marcus Reaper Dalton, Navy SEAL, ceased to exist. In his place was seaman recruit Marcus Dalton, prisoner. Reaper's mother attended the sentencing. She sat in the back of the courtroom, crying quietly while her son was led away in handcuffs. She'd been proud of his service, proud of his decorations. Now she was watching him pay for crimes she hadn't known he was capable of committing. Rebecca Chen stood in the hallway afterward, watching through the window as Reaper was processed for transport to Leavenworth. Bull Patterson had driven up from Virginia to be present for the verdict. He stood beside her, silent. "How do you feel?" Bull asked finally. "Like we won. Like it doesn't feel as good as it should. Justice rarely does. Revenge feels good. Justice just feels necessary." Rebecca turned to face her mentor. "Your daughter didn't get this. She didn't get to see her abuser face consequences." "No, but 7 other people did, because you were brave enough to do the work. Because you didn't let his status or his service record become a shield." Bull pulled out his phone and showed Rebecca a photo. Young woman in marine dress blues, Rebecca Patterson, smiling, alive, full of potential that had been stolen from her. "She'd be proud of what we did today, what you did." Rebecca felt tears she'd been holding back start to fall. She'd been professional through the entire investigation, clinical, detached. But seeing that photo, thinking about the 20-year-old case that could have ended like this one if the system had worked, broke something loose. "We can't save everyone," she said. "No, but we can save some. And we can make sure the ones we couldn't save aren't forgotten. That their deaths meant something. That the system that failed them gets a little bit better." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Rebecca's phone buzzed with a new assignment. Another base, another investigation. Another operator who thought his credentials made him immune to accountability. "You going?" Bull asked. "Yes." "Then come by the farm this weekend. We'll review the case. See what lessons we can apply to the next one." Rebecca nodded. The work continued. It always continued. Because the rot in the system didn't appear overnight, and it wouldn't be fixed overnight. Each case was a small victory in a long war. But they were winning, one case at a time, one abuser held accountable at a time, one victim who saw justice served at a time. 6 months later, Fort Leavenworth Military Prison was exactly as miserable as Reaper had expected. The cells were small, the routine was numbing. The other prisoners were a mix of people who'd made mistakes and people who'd made choices. Reaper fell into the latter category. Mandatory therapy 3 times a week was the worst part. Not because it was painful, but because it forced him to confront everything he'd spent years avoiding. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was a VA psychiatrist who specialized in combat trauma. She didn't let him hide behind his service record or his SEAL status. "Tell me about Afghanistan." 2018, she said during their 8th session. Reaper had been dreading this, avoiding it. But prison had a way of removing the distractions that let you avoid things. Raid on a compound outside Kandahar. Taliban weapons cache. Intelligence said minimal resistance. But intel was wrong, or incomplete. When we breached, there were 14 combatants, 11 adults, 3 teenagers, maybe 15, 16 years old. They came out shooting. His hands trembled. He noticed and forced them still. "I killed all 3 of them. Headshots, center mass, professional, clean, by the book." But they were kids. They should have been worried about school or whatever Afghan teenagers worry about. Instead, they died on a concrete floor because I put bullets in their brains. Doctor. Mitchell made notes. Her expression remained neutral, but not cold. "And you never process that trauma. SEALs don't do therapy. We're supposed to be hard, unbreakable. So you self-medicated with alcohol and aggression, turned your trauma outward, made it everyone else's problem. It wasn't a question. Reaper nodded anyway. Here's what I want you to understand, Marcus. Those deaths weren't your fault. You were in a combat zone. They were armed. They were shooting at you. You responded appropriately within the rules of engagement. She leaned forward. But what you did afterward? How you processed that trauma by hurting people who couldn't fight back? Trauma gives you context. It doesn't give you permission. You had choices. You made bad ones. The sessions continued. Slowly, painfully, Reaper began to understand the difference between explanation and excuse, between trauma and responsibility, between the warrior he'd wanted to be and the bully he'd become. He started writing letters to P.F.C. Martinez, to Lieutenant Hayes, to all 7 complainants. The prison screened them before delivery. The recipients could choose whether to accept them or not. Most were rejected. Martinez accepted his. The letter was simple. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that what I did to you was wrong. Completely. Inexcusably. It had nothing to do with your capability or worth. It was about my brokenness. You deserve better. Every person I hurt deserved better. I'm sorry. Martinez never responded, but he kept the letter. Reaper also wrote to Bull Patterson. That letter was different, more personal. An apology 20 years too late for lessons ignored. You tried to teach me about honor, about the warrior code, about the difference between strength and brutality. I was too arrogant to listen, too convinced that my way was better. I'm sorry for betraying your teachings, for becoming the kind of man you fought against, for not being worthy of the life you saved. Bull's response came 3 weeks later. A single page, handwritten. Marcus, apologies are meaningless without change. Actions matter. Words don't. When you get out, you have a choice. You can become bitter and blame the system that held you accountable, or you can become better and prove that redemption is possible. I'll be watching to see which path you choose. Bull. The letter lived in Reaper's cell. He read it every night before sleep. A reminder, a challenge, a small piece of hope that maybe he wasn't beyond saving. The prison had a program where inmates could volunteer at the facility's training center, helping prepare K9 dogs for military and police work. Reaper applied and was accepted. 3 times a week, he worked with German shepherds in Belgian Malinois, teaching them obedience and protection skills. The dogs didn't care about his past, didn't know he'd been a SEAL or that he'd assaulted a federal investigator. They just responded to how he treated them in the present moment. It was the purest form of judgment Reaper had experienced in years. One of the dogs, a Belgian Malinois named Judge, bonded with him particularly strongly. Judge had been rescued from an abusive situation and was aggressive toward most handlers. But with Reaper, he was calm, responsive, like he recognized something in this particular human. The K9 trainer, a grizzled Marine veteran named Sergeant Mike Torres, noticed the connection. Dogs know, Torres said one day while they watched Judge run drills. They can smell fear, yeah, but they can also smell change, growth. That dog was hurt bad by humans. Took us 6 months before he'd let anyone touch him without trying to bite. What changed? Nothing. We just kept showing up, kept being patient, kept proving we weren't going to hurt him. Eventually, he decided to trust again. Torres looked at Reaper directly. I know who you are, know what you did. Everyone here knows. But that dog doesn't care about your past. He cares about who you are right now, in this moment, when you're handling him. Maybe there's a lesson in that. Reaper thought about that conversation for weeks afterward, about the difference between who he'd been and who he could become, about whether redemption was even possible for someone who'd caused the kind of harm he had. He didn't have answers, but he was starting to ask better questions. Meanwhile, back at Camp Lejeune, the reforms were taking shape. Colonel Harrison, though not personally responsible for the cover-up, had received a letter of reprimand for failing to maintain a climate where complaints could be safely reported. It was a career ender for a man who'd been on track for promotion to general. But Harrison took it as an opportunity rather than a death sentence. He spent his final year before retirement implementing sweeping changes to the base's reporting and accountability systems. Independent ombudsman office where personnel could report misconduct without going through chain of command. Mandatory bystander intervention training that taught Marines how to recognize and interrupt problematic behavior before it escalated. Climate surveys conducted quarterly to identify toxic leadership before it metastasized. Most controversially, Harrison implemented a no hero exceptions policy. Decorations, service records, and operational accomplishments would no longer be considered mitigating factors in misconduct cases. Excellence in combat didn't buy immunity from accountability. The old guard hated it, called it witch hunts and political correctness destroying military culture. The younger generation, especially female service members, felt like they could finally breathe. PFC. David Martinez thrived under the new system. 6 months after Reaper's sentencing, Martinez was promoted to Lance Corporal. A year after that, Corporal. He was selected for Scout Sniper Training, a program that tested the absolute limits of physical and mental endurance. Martinez excelled. The kid who'd been targeted for being small and weak proved to have the exact temperament sniper work required. Patient, precise, able to endure discomfort and maintain focus under pressure. His instructors wrote evaluations that use words like exceptional and natural talent. None of them knew about the obstacle course incident, about the humiliation, about the suicide ideation. Martinez carried those scars privately, but they no longer defined him. Lieutenant Sarah Hayes, now Captain Hayes, took command of a Marine infantry company. In her first meeting with her Marines, she laid out expectations that would have been radical 5 years earlier, but were becoming standard. I don't care about your service record. I don't care about your combat deployments. I don't care if you're force recon or infantry or admin. In this company, everyone is held to the same standard of professional conduct. Anyone who uses their status to intimidate or harass will face consequences. No exceptions, no excuses, no heroes. The Marines had listened in silence, some skeptical, some hopeful, all waiting to see if she meant it. She did. 2 months into her command, a staff sergeant with multiple combat tours made sexually suggestive comments to a junior Marine. Hayes relieved him immediately and initiated formal charges. The staff sergeant's buddies complained, said she was overreacting, said boys will be boys. Hayes stood firm. The charges proceeded. The staff sergeant was reduced in rank and transferred. Word spread through the Marine Corps. Captain Hayes meant what she said. Her command was different, safer, professional. Applications to transfer into her company increased by 400%. Staff Sergeant Jenny Cruz struggled more than anyone with the aftermath. The guilt of complicity ate at her like acid. She'd seen the abuse happening, had been in a position to stop it, had chosen silence instead. She requested and received a transfer to a training command, spent her days teaching new Marines about leadership and ethics and the importance of intervention. Every class began the same way. My name is Staff Sergeant Cruz. 8 years ago, a Navy SEAL pulled me out of a burning vehicle in Afghanistan. He saved my life. 5 years ago, that same SEAL shoved a junior Marine against a wall, and I saw it happen. I said nothing. I chose debt over duty. I chose personal loyalty over organizational integrity. I was wrong. The Marines would sit in uncomfortable silence while Cruz explained her failure in excruciating detail. I'm telling you this because someday you're going to see someone abuse their authority, someone senior, someone respected, someone who's done good things in the past, and you're going to have to choose between speaking up or staying silent. Cruz would look each Marine in the eye. I chose silence. I have to live with that choice. 7 people suffered because I was a coward. Don't be like me. Be better. The lessons resonated. Reports of misconduct increased across units where Cruz's students were stationed. Not because abuse was increasing, but because people were finally reporting it. The silence was breaking. Slowly, imperfectly, but breaking. 18 months after his sentencing, Marcus Dalton was released from Fort Leavenworth. Dishonorable discharge in hand. E1 reduction permanent. Benefits forfeited except VA medical for combat-related conditions. He walked out of prison with one duffel bag containing everything he owned. No Navy SEAL insignia, no rank, no identity beyond a name and a criminal record that would follow him forever. Bull Patterson was waiting in the parking lot, leaning against his truck, 69 years old and looking like a man who'd lived 3 lifetimes. Figured you might need a ride, Bull said. Reaper stopped, stared. Why are you here? Because I told you I believe in redemption, even for cowards. Time to see if I was right. They drove in silence for 30 minutes before Bull spoke again. I've got a job for you, if you want it. Doing what? I'm a dishonorably discharged former SEAL with a conviction for assaulting a federal officer. Nobody's hiring me for anything. I am. Homeless veterans shelter in Richmond needs security. Night shift. Minimum wage. You'd be protecting people who can't protect themselves. People society forgot about. People who made mistakes or had bad luck, or just couldn't handle coming home from war. Bull glanced at him. People like you. Reaper was quiet for a long time. You think I deserve redemption? I think you have a choice. Bitter or better. Nobody can make that choice for you. What if I choose wrong? Then you prove I wasted my time believing in you. Won't be the first time I was wrong about someone. They pulled up to the homeless shelter, a converted warehouse in a rough part of Richmond. The sign out front read, Operation Second Chance. A dozen men, all veterans, sat on the steps smoking and talking. They watched Reaper get out of the truck with the wariness of people who'd learned not to trust easily. This is Marcus, Bull told the shelter director, a former Army Ranger named James Chen. He's starting night security tonight. Chen looked at Reaper, really looked, saw the scars and the shame and the uncertainty. You a veteran? Yes, sir, Navy, discharged. Chen didn't ask what kind of discharge. Didn't need to. The shelter was full of men with dishonorable and other than honorable paperwork. Full of people who'd made bad choices or gotten bad breaks. You ever hurt anyone who didn't deserve it? The question hung in the air. Reaper could lie, could deflect, could make excuses. Yes, sir, multiple people. I was wrong, paid consequences, trying to be better. Chen nodded slowly. Okay then, you'll fit right in. Everyone here has things they're not proud of. We don't judge. We just try to do better today than we did yesterday. He handed Reaper a security uniform and a time card. Shift starts at 2200. Don't be late. The work was humbling in ways Reaper hadn't anticipated. As a SEAL, he'd been elite, special, set apart from normal humanity by training and accomplishment. At the shelter, he was just another body in a uniform, making sure doors stayed locked and residents stayed safe. The veterans who lived there were broken in all the ways Reaper was learning he'd been broken. PTSD, substance abuse, trauma turned inward or outward, or both. Some nights he'd talk to them during his rounds, hear their stories, recognize pieces of himself. One resident, a former Marine named David Thompson, had severe PTSD from Iraq. He'd come home and couldn't hold a job, couldn't maintain relationships, couldn't function in a society that didn't understand what he'd seen and done. I killed people, Thompson said one night during a 3 a.m. conversation. Not in combat, after, when I came home, got into a bar fight, guy died, I went to prison, now I'm here. You getting help? Reaper asked. Therapy twice a week, VA group sessions, Medication for the nightmares. It helps some. Doesn't fix everything. Thompson looked at Reaper. You got that look. Like you've seen things. Done things. What's your story? Reaper hesitated, then decided honesty was the only path forward. I was a SEAL. Good operator. Decorated. But I brought my war home wrong. Took my trauma out on people who didn't deserve it. Assaulted a federal investigator. Went to Leavenworth for 18 months. Thompson whistled low. That's a hell of a fall. Yeah. You bitter about it? The question echoed Bull's challenge. I'm trying not to be, trying to focus on being better instead. How's that working out? Ask me in a year. The months passed. Reaper worked nights at the shelter, attended VA therapy sessions, started taking online classes in counseling and social work, slowly built something that resembled a life from the wreckage of his past. He didn't advertise his SEAL background, didn't talk about his combat record. That person felt like someone else, someone he'd been before he understood the difference between strength and brutality. Bull checked in monthly, never stayed long, just making sure Reaper was still on the path toward better rather than bitter. How's the work? Bull asked during one visit. Hard, humbling, good. You still doing therapy? 3 times a month, VA group for combat veterans, individual sessions with Dr. Mitchell. She helping? Making me face things I'd rather avoid. So yeah, helping. Bull nodded approvingly. Rebecca asked about you. Reaper looked up sharply. Agent Chen? She's working another case, another base, another operator who thought his credentials made him untouchable. She wanted to know if you'd recovered. What did you tell her? That recovery isn't something you achieve. It's something you practice. Every day. And you're practicing. 5 years after his release from Leavenworth, Marcus Dalton had built something that resembled peace. Not happiness. The people he'd hurt didn't get happiness, and neither did he. But peace. The kind that comes from accepting consequences and doing the work of becoming better. He was assistant director of the homeless veterans shelter now, helped run programs, counseled residents, used his own story as a cautionary tale about what happens when you let trauma turn you into something you're not. He still had nightmares about Afghanistan, about the 3 teenage boys, about the mess hall floor, and Rebecca Chen standing over him. But the nightmares were manageable now, part of the landscape of his mind, rather than floods that swept everything away. PFC Martinez, now Gunnery Sergeant Martinez, reached out via email one day. The message was brief. Heard you're working with homeless vets. Good work. Doesn't erase the past, but it's something. I'm doing okay. Thanks for asking back then. Martinez. Reaper read the email 50 times, cried more than he'd admit, responded with equal brevity. Thank you for telling your story, for being brave when I was a coward. Hope you're well. Marcus. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. It was enough. Rebecca Chen continued her work with DIA, case after case, base after base, operator after operator who thought their status made them immune to accountability. The conviction rate remained high, the resistance remained fierce, but the culture was slowly shifting. Bull Patterson, now 72, still consulted on cases, still trained investigators, still carried his daughter's photo, still worked toward a military where her death would matter, where the system would protect victims instead of predators. One evening, Rebecca drove to Bull's farm to brief him on a completed case. Another conviction, another abuser held accountable. They sat on his porch, watching the sun set over Virginia farmland. How many is that now? Bull asked. 43 convictions in 7 years. Dozens more cases that led to administrative punishments or discharges. 43 people who thought they were untouchable, who learned they weren't. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Do you think it's enough? Does it balance the scales for your daughter? Bull looked at Rebecca Patterson's photo, visible through the window. Nothing balances those scales. She's still dead. The man who killed her is still living comfortably in retirement. That injustice doesn't get undone. He turned to Rebecca Chen. But 43 predators face consequences they wouldn't have faced without our work. Hundreds of potential victims were protected because those predators were removed. The culture is changing. Slowly, imperfectly, but changing. That's what Rebecca would have wanted. That's her legacy. They sat in silence as darkness fell. "What about Dalton?" Rebecca asked. "You still track him?" "He's doing good work. Homeless veterans shelter. Counseling. Using his story to help others avoid his mistakes. It doesn't erase his crimes, but it suggests redemption is possible." "You believe that? That people like him can actually change?" Bull thought about Vietnam, about all the men he'd killed and the ones he'd saved, about his daughter and the system that failed her, about Marcus Dalton and the choice between bitter and better. "I believe people can surprise you, both ways. I've seen good men become monsters. I've seen monsters remember how to be men. Dalton chose the hard path. That counts for something." Rebecca stood to leave, stopped at the porch steps. "I got a new assignment, Camp Lejeune, full investigation of systemic issues. They want someone who knows the base." "That's where we started, where you took down Dalton." 5 years later, time to see if the reforms stuck, if the culture really changed. Bull smiled. "You nervous?" "Terrified. What if we didn't change anything? What if it was all just theater and the rot's still there? Then we do the work again, and however many times it takes. That's the job. You know that." Rebecca descended the steps, turned back one final time. "Bull, thank you for everything, for training me, for believing this work matters, for keeping your daughter's memory alive through action instead of just grief. Thank you for being the weapon she needed, the one I couldn't be for her." Rebecca drove away. Bull returned to his porch and his daughter's photo and the twilight settling over the farm. 5 years and 3 months after the confrontation, Rebecca Chen walked into the Camp Lejeune mess hall at 06:43 hours. Same corner table, same technical manual, different mission. The base had changed. She could feel it in the way Marines moved through the space. Easier, less tension. Female personnel sat without the hypervigilance she'd seen before. Junior enlisted didn't flinch when senior NCOs passed. "Ma'am?" Rebecca looked up. A young gunnery sergeant stood beside her table. Hispanic, maybe 5'6", compact and confident. His name tape read, Martinez. "Gunny Martinez, I recognize you from the files." Martinez's expression flickered. "You're the investigator from that morning." "I am. How are you doing?" "Good, ma'am, really good. Scout sniper instructor now. Teaching kids that excellence doesn't require ego." He paused. "Thank you for what you did, for making them listen. You made them listen when you told your story. I just provided the platform." A woman in captain's bars approached. Hayes. Sarah Hayes. No longer the terrified lieutenant from the supply room. Now carrying herself like someone who'd learned that speaking up doesn't make you weak, it makes you dangerous. "Agent Chen, heard you were back on base. Conducting another investigation?" "Follow-up assessment, seeing if the reforms took root or if they were just performative." Hayes smiled. Not the nervous smile of a victim, the confident smile of a leader who'd built something worth protecting. "Come observe my company, see for yourself." The three of them stood in the mess hall where it had all happened, where one man's fall had created space for others to rise, where accountability had replaced immunity, where the untouchable had learned he wasn't. "Staff Sergeant Dalton sends his regards," Rebecca said quietly. "He wanted me to tell you both. He's proud of who you became despite what he did. Not because of it, despite it." Martinez and Hayes exchanged glances. The kind of look that survivors share when someone mentions the thing that broke them but didn't destroy them. "Tell him," Martinez said carefully, That we're doing the work of being better. That's the only message that matters. Rebecca nodded, packed her materials, rose to leave. As she reached the exit, she paused. Same door, same moment. 5 years of distance. She didn't look back this time. Didn't need to. The work continued. The untouchables kept learning. The system kept getting slightly less broken. One case at a time. One voice heard at a time. One person held accountable at a time. The sun rose over Camp Lejeune. Somewhere in Richmond, Marcus Dalton was ending his shift at the homeless veterans shelter, practicing redemption one night at a time. Somewhere in California, Captain Hayes was commanding her Marines with zero tolerance for abuse and infinite patience for those learning to be better. Somewhere in North Carolina, Gunnery Sergeant Martinez was training the next generation of scout snipers, teaching them excellence without ego. And somewhere on the road between Virginia and North Carolina, Rebecca Chen was driving toward her next interview, carrying Bull Patterson's teachings and his daughter's memory, ready to prove once again that accountability applied to everyone. It would never be perfect, but it was better, and better was enough.